Hello, this is Dr. Irene Hausinger, and this is the lecture for Chapter 9 in your Uppers, Downers, All-Arounders book, Treatment. There are a lot of different types of treatment, and there are different contemporary issues in treatment as well. The most prevalent mind disorder is substance abuse. It is still classified as a disease. It causes more illness, death, and social disruption than any other chronic medical illness, as well as costs our society more than any other medical condition. We're looking at costs, we're looking at lost wages, crisis things, traffic accidents, medical costs, all of that wrapped up, treatment costs, criminal justice costs. So one of the things that we need to look at is harms to self and then harms to the user as well. So here we have a chart where you can see we have untreated addiction, which is estimated to be about 30,000 to 150,000 per person, versus incarceration, which is about a year per person. Probation, residential long-term treatment, residential short-term treatment, methadone maintenance, intensive outpatient, and outpatient treatment. I would say intensive outpatient is a little bit more like 5,000, depending. And a lot of this does depend on insurance as well. But without splitting hairs, you can definitely see, and again, untreated addiction, all of those different costs, the cost of incarcerating somebody, the cost of ER visits, the cost of lost property if things are stolen. So in untreated addiction, we have this huge umbrella of different things that can happen there. In addition to methadone maintenance, we also have other MATs that are being widely used today, such as Suboxone, buprenorphine, Subutex, Vivitrol, Naltrexone, Naloxone, etc. So I do want to also put other MATs in the methadone category. Prices will vary. Okay. Let's look at some of the current issues in treatment. There is an expanding use of medications to treat detoxification, control withdrawal symptoms, lessen craving, and promote short and long-term abstinence. Okay. Most of these are for opiates. Some are for opiates and alcohol. Naltrexone specifically is used in general as an opiate blocker and has also been used to treat cocaine addiction. Advanced imaging methods and other diagnostic techniques visualize anomalies of the human brain that could lead to addiction or that are a result of addiction and serve to predict treatment outcomes. So we can do brain scans and look at what's going on in the brain in terms of addiction. There are more effective tools to diagnose addiction and to better match clients to specific treatment interventions. And this is very important because a one-size-fits-all treatment doesn't work very well. When the ASAM was redone in 2013, and I don't think that this is always applied the way it should be, but the ASAM is supposed to let the clinician be flexible with the client in terms of what's the best course of treatment for the client. It doesn't have to fit a 14, 21, 28, 30, 60, 90 type program. It's supposed to be more flexible. Whether or not that always happens in practice, that is a different case. An evolving science of their neurophysiology involved with craving and recovery is helping explain why some people experiencing chronic relapses while others do not. So we have, again, with the brain scans and our understanding of cravings, we can look at chronic relapse as what it is and employ different methodologies and techniques to help those people that are chronically relapsing. There is an emphasis on evidence-based practices and a decreased appreciation of practice-based clinical management. I do want to be careful with the term evidence-based, though, because if there's one study that says that it works, then technically there's evidence for it, even if there's 492 studies that say that it's not so effective. So be careful with the buzzwords of evidence-based. Don't accept that at face value. Actually do some work in there. And that's kind of how the whole anti-vax thing got started. There was a medical doctor who got a paper published in the Lancet, which was is a very prestigious medical journal from England. And because it was published in this journal, which they later retracted, and they've issued many apologies, and I believe the doctor was disgraced and lost their license for publishing this paper. And they basically lied and said that they fabricated these numbers that vaccines cause autism. I'm not getting into that debate, but what I am getting into is because there was one study that was published, but then it was retracted, and the author said they made it up. We have this whole movement based around that one study because it's quote unquote evidence based. And the fact that it was retracted drives conspiracy theory people absolutely batty because they're like, well, it was retracted because it's the truth. So I want you all to be very careful when we're looking at what evidence based actually means. Okay. Research supports the theory that coerced treatment when linked to community programs, is as effective as voluntary treatment admissions. I'm going to say that again. Research supports the theory that coerced treatment, such as drug courts, when linked to community programs, is as effective as voluntary treatment admissions. Drug court is still a voluntary program. You still have a choice between I'm going to jail or I'm going to get treatment. So I do want to say that there is a choice there. Prison time, jail time, or treatment, that is still a choice. And a person could choose, no, I'm just going to go to jail. And that does happen. And a person could choose to drop out of drug court as well. So when we say court ordered, there's still a choice there. It's the same thing for anger management or domestic violence or anything like that. The person could still choose not to go, but those consequences might be a little bit harsher than actually going to treatment. So there is a choice in the matter. I want to clarify that. Okay. And one of the things that we look at is changing motivation. Somebody might be externally motivated, like I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to lose my house. I don't want to lose my relationships. If I go to jail, that's going to happen. So I'm going to go to treatment, even though I don't want to. I have to. There's still a choice there. But over time, the motivation usually shifts to, okay, maybe there is something in this for me. Maybe I'm going to examine myself a little bit and look at what that means. And so just because somebody is externally motivated for treatment doesn't mean that, they're necessarily the old language of in denial or they have to hit rock bottom. It's not that. Remember the stages of change and being ambivalent to change, and that this is a cyclical process that a person can go in and out of many, many, many times. So just because the motivation is external doesn't mean that that can change, and it often does. And drug courts are usually community-based. They are in the community that you're in. And so the statement is very potent because it's saying, and this goes back to the arguments that the opposite of addiction is connection, that if we're in the community, we're going to have connections, and that's where the effectiveness comes from. There are a lack of resources to provide proven treatment. There absolutely are. And the number of people that actually get treatment, that need treatment, is something like 3% or so, something very, very, very narrow like that. There's a huge conflict between abstinence-oriented recovery and harm reduction treatment philosophies. And we're seeing that. I think that we're becoming more progressive. But you're going to see more harm reduction towards opiates because we have the medication for that. You're not going to see as much alcohol harm reduction in a traditional treatment setting. And there are mixed feelings on that. So one thing is, if you have a no use order, let's say you get a DUI, the judge says no alcohol, no marijuana. Okay, you can't use. Okay, so you couldn't necessarily help somebody with harm reduction or moderating their drinking where they keep drinking, but it's conscious drinking. That might sound funny, conscious drinking. But they're charting it, they're journaling it, they're noticing when drinks go up and down to raise awareness. You couldn't do that with that. There are other methods like the Sinclair method where you use naltrexone to extinguish the cravings And you do that by taking a naltrexone pill an hour before you have alcohol, and you have to do this every day. And then there's a behavioral component as well. And it takes about 3 to 4 months before the person's no longer a problem drinker. But it would be counterintuitive, especially at an abstinence only place, and it wouldn't work with the current criminal justice system. Let's say if you had a DUI, to do that. If you were just trying to cut back drinking on your own and you aren't externally motivated by someone that says you can't drink, then that could be an option. So, and that program has a 76 or 78% success rate, with 25% of people going to abstinence only, which is fine. There's no wrong door to treatment. So there are some models that have almost 20 years of efficacy and evidence behind them, but wouldn't work within the current system. Improvements in positive treatment outcomes show 12-month continuous recovery rates ranging to 80% in some treatment practices, resulting in $4 to $39 savings for every $1 spent on treatment and a 75% reduction in crime. So in short, it is more cost effective to treat people than it is to incarcerate people. Okay. And if we look at treatment on an intervention and prevention spectrum, it's all the same thing. Treatment is an intervention, and it's also prevention for further issues. Okay. So let's look at this chart here. Percentage of arrestees testing positive for any drug. You see differences in women and men, and drug choice varies between genders, amongst genders. Jails and prisons test for illicit drugs, but not for alcohol. In addition to alcohol, the most common drugs found in arrestees are marijuana and cocaine. However, this is a little funky here, because how would they know that if they're not testing for it? So maybe they're verifying it by smelling or looking at the eyes or other telltale signs that a person's intoxicated with alcohol. Okay. But you know from your book that there are some really poignant statistics there in terms of alcohol and arrests, etc. Okay. So this is from 2000 to 2010, admissions to drug treatment by primary substance of abuse. And look at that. Alcohol, lots of alcohol. We do see an increase in opiates. And this went up even way after 2010, because in 2010, that's when OxyContin changed their formula so that it was more difficult to crush and smoke or snort a pill. It turned into gel. But the way to get around that was you could dip the pill into Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola strips everything, and it would strip it of that coat. And then after it dried, then you could do that. But anyways, it was at that exact time when so many people went from smoking pills to heroin. And I see a direct correlation between changing the OxyContin formula, and other clinicians and researchers will tell you the same thing. Saw a huge spike between December 2010 and January, February 2011. It was like night and day. So it's, again, policy and things changing can create huge waves in trends. We are seeing cocaine go back up now. From 2017 onwards, especially worldwide. Marijuana use is up, especially after legalization in Colorado and Washington State in 2013. Okay. Right. Principles and goals of treatment. Principles include offering a variety of readily available programs, using medications in conjunction with individual and group therapy, and treating coexisting conditions along with the addiction. Goals include motivating clients towards abstinence and reconstructing their lives to exclude drug use. And again, we come back to the abstinence versus harm reduction argument. And more clinicians and treatment centers and university centers are arguing that this is really the only field where a person is, if you're not abstinent, we're not going to treat you. Or, you're not in compliance if you're not abstinent. And that's pretty ridiculous. And it could also be seen as cruel. You're not doing what I want you to do, so You're just going to have to go further and further and further into consequences until you do what we want you to do. It's not really a great medical model. Assessment and screening tools help treatment professionals match a client to the best program. So we've gone over screening and assessment, and you know the differences between adolescent and adult tools and screening and assessment. Providing a range of treatment approaches, customizing treatment for culture, gender, and ethnicity improves outcomes. And so it is important to look at the different trends, the different substances, the different groups use, and why. So here we have a sample protocol for how somebody might get involved in treatment. This is a typical clinic outpatient medical model program requiring a physician. It illustrates the complexity of treating a compulsive drug user, particularly if other problems such as medical conditions, mental problems like a dual diagnosis, or HIV are involved. So, and one of the things that was recently in play that is now not going to be the case anymore, and had good intentions. Previously, prior to a couple years ago, you could just go to detox if you were intoxicated. But with co-occurring and integrated care, one of the ideas was to have your primary care provider be more involved because so many people had addictions and their primary care doctor had no idea. So the idea was to make the primary care doctor the main person involved in a person's care. Okay, sounds good, right? Okay. So what ended up happening was there was a law put in place, a rule put in place that you couldn't just go to detox anymore. That wasn't allowed. You had to either get a referral from your doctor or show up in the emergency room intoxicated, which puts up a barrier. And there was just legislation passed in Washington January, February, no later than March of 2020, that you don't have to have a pre-authorization anymore for treatment, which is huge because it could take a week or so to get a pre-auth back. Pre-authorization is where you basically do an assessment with the person and then send it to the insurance company, and then somebody that's never met your client has to deem them to be sick enough and in need of treatment. And so the issue with that is if a person is ready to go to treatment that day, that's when you need to get them to treatment because motivation changes. They risk overdosing, they risk running away, they risk changing their minds. If a person says, I'm ready to go to detox, I want to go to treatment, the best thing to do is try to find a way to do it that day. So by putting that doctor limitation there, that created a lot of problems. And then with the intake pre-authorization, that created a lot of problems too. So things are changing a little bit. I believe that you still do have to go through your doctor or the ER, but for detox. But in terms of treatment, like outpatient or inpatient, you don't have to wait for pre-approval anymore from the insurance company, which is a great step to relieve a barrier. So let's say that this is an emergency and you go to the ER or you go to see your doctor, okay, they're going to triage you. And so if you're overdosing or you're going to withdrawal and it's bad, they're going to send you to the hospital. Sometimes it's an ambulatory thing where if you're supervised and have somebody that can monitor you and it's not life-threatening, then they can give you a detox cocktail at home that you might take for 2 to 3 days. Okay? Or maybe you need another referral. Maybe the person has to go to the psych hospital or whatever it is. Okay, so one of these 3 things happens, okay, and that gets you to the intake counselor. Okay. The intake process, which we have discussed, is where you would go to the center, fill out paperwork, get an assessment. Okay. Now, sometimes intake and assessment are not the same thing. Some places are going to call the intake after you've done the assessment, and intake means that you're doing the paperwork to admit yourself to that facility. But generally, the intake counselor or sometimes it's called the assessment counselor, they're going to do an assessment and then they're going to determine what level of care that you need to be in. And then they assign you to a group based off of your schedule and what group has space, etc. Okay, so the intake slash admissions counselor is usually not going to be your group counselor, and you'll probably have several different group counselors depending on what phase you were in. Okay. So maybe let's say that you're there for opiates and you want to be on a Suboxone maintenance program. Cool. And then it's always a good idea, especially if you have this person here, to get checked out completely. A lot of people do neglect their medical and dental care, especially when they're using. And maybe there are other things that we need here. Maybe the person has undiagnosed ADD or ADHD or undiagnosed depression or needs grief counseling or a whole variety of things. And in addition to the group process, you're going to have individual, or we call them one-on-ones, with your counselor as well. So if that was confusing to you or felt like a lot, imagine being kind of in and out of it and trying to navigate this system. All right. So the first step of treatment, your book author says, breaking through denial. So some people like this term denial. Some people don't like the term denial. It's kind of an old 12-step based thing. And harm reduction people and motivational interviewing people, they don't like the word denial. They like the word ambivalence. Because denial and ambivalence, a lot of people say, well, you can't get help unless you know that there's a problem. Well, people know that there's a problem. It's not that they don't know that there's a problem. It's that they don't know what to do about it, because changing could be way scarier than staying where you're at. There's a lot of unknowns when you make changes. So the thing is that you don't have to wait for a person. And the idea of rock bottom, a lot of people think is a little bit ridiculous. I've met people that were in prison for 20 years because of drunk driving. They killed somebody, and then 20 years later, they're still drinking and driving, and they're on their, how many umpteenth treatment attempt. Or then you have somebody that they missed their kids' play because they had a hangover, and that was enough to be like, oh, I need to make changes. So the idea that you have to lose everything, that's kind of a sensationalized Hollywood type thing, in my opinion. And it's a fallacy. You can motivate somebody at any level. Motivational interviewing is really fantastic, and the principles of motivational interviewing state that you can do great work with your client at any stage. It's about facilitating a conversation. And part of that might be harm reduction. If the person's not ready to be abstinent or they're not ready to go to treatment, what can we do to keep you safe? Okay. So I want you to kind of challenge some of those ideas. And you're going to see differences between this book and your Van Wormer textbook. Okay. So this textbook says that hitting bottom leads the user into treatment, as does direct intervention. Sometimes not. Interventionists will say that intervention is 100% effective because it gets the family on the same page. So regardless of whether or not the person is going to go to treatment or decides to become sober or whatnot, that the family stops enabling and that the family decides to be on the same page, which could be true. Okay, so it depends. But intervention is a business and can cost $1,500 to $3,000. And a lot of times you could just do it yourself. But sometimes these interventions are linked to treatment programs, and they might waive the fee if you go to their program. But okay. So what we want to look at is a continuum of care. And this is a debate too, like how long are you addicted? If you've been in recovery for 30 years, are you still an addict? That's kind of a philosophical discussion. Your book author says, once a person is addicted, treatment and recovery become a lifetime process that involves rebuilding one's lifestyle to live sober and drug-free. That's true for a lot of people, but maybe in varying degrees to other people as well. And the truth is, in your books, you talk about this, is that most people kind of age out of addiction, and it's about 10 years of use. And part of that is that people just have life goals and they get tired of it and they want to change. And we do know that that does happen for some people. They just can't get out of it. But the majority of people do, and the majority of people do so without treatment because there's not a lot of access to treatment. It's called a natural recovery. If we're looking at detox, like a hospital detox, detox uses medical care, emotional support, and medications to control withdrawal symptoms, reduce craving, and move the client to initial abstinence. Alcohol and benzodiazepines, if they've been used for a very long time and in certain amounts, can kill a person if they're trying to withdraw on their own. So it's very important when you are doing an assessment to really look at dimensions 1 and 2 for withdrawal potential, withdrawal history, and co-occurring to see how life-threatening could withdrawal be to your person. And it's important to note that you don't die from a heroin withdrawal. It's very unpleasant. People feel like they're going to die. Heroin addicts especially, are most vulnerable after detox because of tolerance. So let's say a person was using 1 to 3 grams of heroin a day. They go to detox. They don't have any tolerance anymore. They're at baseline 0. They decide to use again and they use 1 to 3 grams. They have a really high chance of overdosing and dying because they don't have tolerance anymore. So that's one of the ideas where having a continuum door to door is really important. Withdrawal assessment tools help determine the medications necessary to effectively suppress withdrawal symptoms. In hospitals, it's usually called a CWAS scale, where they're going to be looking at how intense the withdrawal symptoms are. Initial abstinence entails counseling, anti-craving medications, drug substitution, and desensitization techniques to rebalance body chemistry, continue abstinence, and prevent relapse due to environmental triggers. Long-term abstinence requires continued participation in counseling and groups to prevent relapse and learn new living habits. So it can be really challenging too. And let's say a person's been abstinent for 10 years. Can they start drinking again? Some people can, some people can't. But because of what happens to the brain during addiction, and your text talks about this, a person that's been addicted to something is more vulnerable to future addictions in other classifications of drugs and in their own classification of drugs. I've seen a lot of trends with clients over the years where, especially with meth addicts, they had meth problem early on. They're sober from meth for like 10 years, and then boom, all of a sudden they have full-blown alcoholism and they have no idea why. They never really drank before. They switched classes of drugs. They switched from an upper to a downer. And it's fairly common and it surprises people. It really does. But we have to look at what happens to addiction in the brain, that you are vulnerable to more addiction. So that's one of the arguments for abstinence only. Like, are you going to tempt fate? Do you think that you'd be okay? Do you want to take the risk of using again and then maybe having a full-blown addiction again? So that's one of the, and it's a good argument for abstinence-based. Okay. So let's look at this chart. This is admissions by source of referral in the United States. So we have a lot of admissions, 1.8 million. Okay, so look, alcohol, ooh, alcohol, alcohol with other drugs, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine. Okay, and this is criminal justice. So look at this. This is shameful. I'm going to say it. It's shameful. DUI and criminal justice. Criminal justice system is not healthcare. It shouldn't be used as healthcare. This is why we have a lot of problems. This is an encouraging number, though. A third of people say, like, I'm done and I want to come in. So that's pretty encouraging. This might be, you're going, this is probably a little ambiguous. Like, are you going there? Why are you there? Etc. So I know I said that this is shameful, and it is. But what we wanted to look at is the no wrong door to treatment approach, which means that if a person becomes sober because they're arrested, cool. If they become sober because they're tired of it, cool. If they are, referred or admitted by a substance abuse provider, awesome. Any of these other things, cool. So no wrong door to treatment. whatever gets the person there, gets the person there. However, I do stand by this that we should not be relying on the criminal justice system. We need more prevention and intervention. And this is my political platform. We need healthcare. If we had healthcare, look how small this number is. I think that if we had healthcare, this number would go up and this number would go down because criminal justice is being used as a substitute for healthcare. That includes mental health, that includes public health. Okay, so that's Dr. Hausinger's rant. But you cannot separate politics from this issue. You absolutely cannot. Because the person is political and the political is personal. Okay. Other community referral, that could be church, that could be religious programs, that could be nonprofit programs, that could be housing programs, public programs. And most programs do screen or will have references and referrals for people like, if this is an issue for you. So this could be going to a homeless shelter. This could be being in a housing program or being in a literacy program. So this could be a lot of different things. Employer EAP, Employee Assistance Program, usually that's through HR. And because addiction's covered by the ADA, if you're involved with the EAP, they're not supposed to fire you. They could get in trouble for that. And I know that there are certain states that are at will to work, like Washington is. But if you go through your EAP, then they have to let you have treatment. They have to. Okay. All right. Relapse prevention is the focus of every level of treatment, which is interesting too because you have, if somebody is practicing harm reduction and they're still actively using, how are they not relapsing? So there's a difference between lapse and a relapse. But what we want to look at is really looking at harm reduction and how do we prevent people from doing harmful things. And if a person was to relapse, how can we make that relapse less harmful? Okay. With relapse prevention, we treat cognitive deficits like critical thinking errors and criminal thinking errors, post-acute withdrawal symptom, which is pause, and internal and external triggers. Okay. And some of that is related to brain science and craving, euphoric recall, etc. Okay. Outcome and follow-up evaluations improve the value of treatment. Okay. So here, to switch gears for a little bit, we have a PET scan of a healthy brain and a heavy cocaine user's brain and how long it can take. So you can see all of the different areas of the brain lit up. Okay, and after 10 days, we're seeing some here. But after 100 days, it's still pretty far off from this. Sugar addiction is even worse than this if you were to look at the brain scans for sugar addiction. Okay. In general, we're going to say that for most drugs, it's going to take a year of abstinence for the brain to come to a baseline functioning. And what really, really helps with that, diet and exercise. Get the brain chemicals pumping in the way that they're supposed to, and the body will repair itself. The body is pretty amazing. Okay. Here we have an MRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, looking at regional brain activity in recovering methamphetamine abusers when they performed decision making. The images show the areas that were significantly less active in those who relapsed than in those who stayed in recovery. Those underperforming areas predicted relapse. Isn't that interesting? So we can actually look at the brain and see where we're at for risk of relapse in terms of decision making. So post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or PAWS, is well documented in the medical literature. It occurs when the person is sober and has not had any substances, but they feel like they're still in withdrawal. And this is pretty predictable. It happens a week after stopping use, and then a month, and then every 30 days, even up to 8 years after the person's last used. And some of this can include using dreams, like having a dream where you think that you're using your drug and waking up all freaked out that you broke your sobriety. Very common. So, pause can include sleep disturbances, memory problems, the inability to think clearly, anxiety and hypersensitivity to stress, inappropriate emotional reactions and mood swings, and physical coordination difficulties. So, it's a high stress period of time. And what I recommend people to do is actually mark it on your calendar and then give yourself extra self care. Like, why am I feeling anxious and why do I feel so crummy? Well, you're might be in the time frame for pause. And one of the issues with that is the prime relapse time is 12 to 14 months. So many people relapse after a year, largely because of pause or becoming complacent or feeling like they got it. And so if a person's involved in 12 step, I highly implore them to have a sponsor that has a lot of time. If a person has a year, you don't want to say, well, they're going to relapse. They might not, but the person is vulnerable. And so people get super excited and like, I'm going to sponsor someone. I've had a year clean. And then they relapsed. And then that person is like, oh my gosh, my sponsor can make it. I can't make it either. And that's really discouraging. So I think that's really important. And this is something that can be planned for. So a person should make sure that they're sleeping and eating and doing things for self-care and managing their stress and exercising and doing all that, maybe getting extra support, going to counseling, etc. Okay. So in treatment, you have individual counseling, you have peer groups, you have 12-step groups, self-help groups, right? So a peer group or a 12-step group, 12-step groups are peer groups. It's not facilitated by a professional. It's facilitated by somebody that has the same issue that you do. So it's not therapy, it's support. That's really an important distinction to make. And you have facilitated group therapy with a therapist, educated, licensed person, and then educational groups. Usually that's where they tell you this is the drug and this is what it does. By law, we have to do that, but we know research-wise it doesn't really work very well. Think of the DARE program. They don't work well. However, we have psychoeducation groups, which is where you learn something and then apply it to yourself. So it's half lecture, half therapy, and those do work. But just saying this is a drug, drugs are bad, okay, that doesn't work really, really well. Right? Treatment must involve the entire family. The problems of codependency, enabling, and how children are influenced by an alcoholic, addicted family member must all be addressed. And the family's on the same page, especially with boundaries. Recovery is going to be a lot smoother and a united front, so to speak. And we never cause somebody's addiction, but we can contribute to negative behaviors when our behaviors are not enlightened towards addiction. So, for example, if you, let's say that you're with a person, you're the romantic partner of somebody that's using drugs or alcohol, and you're tired of being lied to because you can be lied to quite a bit, and you say, if you lie to me and you're still using, we're done. And you're not going to live here anymore, and our relationship is over. Well, of course the person's going to lie because they don't want to be homeless. So making ultimatums and threats like that is not helpful at all, and it can often drive that behavior even further underground, which is the opposite of what you want. So what you could do is have a contingency plan, like, okay, these are my boundaries. If this happens, then this is what's going to happen, and not threaten. But the other thing is, if you draw a line in the sand and constantly erase that line, then the person knows how to push your buttons, and they don't believe you because you're just saying things and you're not going to be backing that up. Okay. Right. There are a lot of adjunctive and complementary treatment services these days and alternatives, which I think is really important to discuss. Abuse and addiction have a negative impact on a user's physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. Evidence-based treatments address the components, result in positive outcomes. But there are alternative approaches like psychedelics and acupuncture and yoga. However, yoga and acupuncture, they're not, there is more evidence now. So this book was written in 2014, this latest iteration. There is a lot more evidence for it. Now, there's not a whole lot of evidence for equine therapy. A lot of the equine therapy research is around PTSD and military and families, but not so much addiction specific. And I guess they make the case that, trauma, there's a lot of trauma and addiction. The yoga research is definitely promising, and acupuncture is absolutely promising as well. But then we're looking at other things like MATs and maybe using psychedelics. But the important thing is not just to do one thing, and it's very much like exercising. If you want to get super buff and you go to the gym, you're going to get partially buff. But if you sleep enough and you have a solid diet that is calculated and you go to the gym, you're going to have much better results. And it's the same thing with addiction treatment. It really should be a wraparound approach. And we look at those 6 dimensions in a person's life to meet the plan. Okay. All right. So the author of your textbook, Dr. Inaba, who's a super cool guy, developed these guidelines if a person has a bad trip. Okay, so gain the user's trust and confidence. Maybe they're on LSD and they think that you're a tree. Be a friendly tree. Reduce the stimuli. Get them to a quiet, non-threatening environment. Reassure them. Tell them that they're experiencing a bad trip and assure them that they're safe amongst safe people and that they will be all right. Help them rest. Help them use stress reduction techniques, maybe soft music, dim lights, aromatherapy, like lavender, something calming, and then talk them down. Discuss peaceful, non-threatening subjects with the user, avoiding any topic that seems to cause more anxiety or a strong reaction. Okay. Don't try to have deep philosophical conversations with people when they're under the influence. And you always want to make sure that you're safe. Conflict resolution, especially if someone's under alcohol, is not so great. Okay. You have to keep yourself safe. Okay. Certain psychoactive drugs call for specialized medical and counseling treatment techniques like methadone maintenance, stimulant abuse groups, or dual diagnosis groups. Office-based opiate addiction treatment using buprenorphine is now an option. A lot of treatment centers are going to have a physician that contracts with them, that might be in the office a couple days a week. This is becoming a more common practice. Around 2012, a bunch of doctor shops, and I call them doctor shops, opened. Basically, you could just go in there without any accountability and get Suboxone, which is buprenorphine. And the problem with that is that there was no treatment. There was no behavioral modification. There was no counseling. It was just, here, take this pill and stop using heroin. That works some of the time. But again, it's really important to have a solid wraparound approach. Okay. Behavioral addictions, like eating disorders, gambling, require the same intensity of intervention and treatment as do substance use disorders, but they're usually from the mental health side. And they have been treated differently, maybe with more efficacy and better results than traditional drug treatment. Okay. Because needs vary, treatment must be culturally specific for ethnicity, gender, and language. I want to include spirituality in there as well. There has been a lot of pushback to 12-step because it has been ruled as a religious program rooted in Judeo-Christian traditions. It's not bad. It works for some people, but we have to be culturally competent to all religions and spiritual traditions. Okay. Here we have a chart, alcohol only and marijuana hashish treatment admissions by age, 2010. Because alcohol dependence takes longer to develop than dependence on other drugs, admissions for treatment occur later in life, peaking after the age of 45. I would say, anecdotally, witnessing people, that is absolutely true. And because alcohol is so culturally accepted, a lot of people don't know that they're an alcoholic. They have no idea. They just think it's normal. and that this is what's in their culture or their family, and they have no idea it's problematic until something outside happens, maybe a DUI or something like that. Very, very, very common. And so we must treat everybody with compassion, but especially people that are shocked to learn that they're alcoholics. The vast majority of those entering treatment for marijuana are under the age of 30, and more than half of the referrals for treatment are court mandated. And I would argue that that's probably gone up. And so since more states are legalizing it, we have to treat it like alcohol. So people are like, well, how do you treat that? Because it's legal, same as alcohol. It's okay until you have a problem with it, or maybe okay is not the best word, but you know what I mean. Great. Developmental arrest, lack of cognition, conflicting goals, relationship, family strife, insurmountable debt, financial problems, continued association with dysfunctional peers, poor follow through, and lack of facilities are the main obstacles in treatment. And that is also gender specific, especially for females that are the primary caretakers for their children. There are more than 60 medications focusing on detoxification, replacement or agonist therapies, antagonist or vaccine effects, anti-craving effects, and restoration of homeostasis that are in development. Probably even more so today. So, again, if nothing else from this lecture, please remember that it's important to hit it from all different sides. We want to look at medical treatment, medical MATs, if it's available and appropriate. We want to look at counseling. We want to look at getting the person involved in their community. There's no easy answer for this. And most importantly, be open. Listen to your client. They are the best expert on themselves. Thank you so much. See you next time.